So you have a tenant who always pays late. Today we're going to figure out a way to fix that. Let's get started. The payment of rent is probably the most fundamental part of your lease. And if your tenant is getting this wrong time and time again, first and foremost, that's probably a good indication that they're just not a good fit for you and your business goals. Remember that this is a business, and if you're treating it like a hobby, well, you're not going to get a good result in the end. But if you are treating this as a business, then you're going to hold your tenant to the terms of the business agreement that you entered into. That's your lease. And again, the promise to pay rent is an absolute. He doesn't get to stay if he doesn't pay. But how can you get your tenant to consistently pay rent on time? Is there anything you could be doing differently to make that a reality? Actually, there are a few things. First, it's important to understand when rent is late. And I know you're thinking, Ernie, seriously, it's right there in black and white. Is it though? Is it that clear to you? Could you explain when your rent is actually due? If it's a range of dates, that's probably not right. Review the provisions of your lease that describe when rent is due. Chances are your lease says something to the effect that rent is due on or before the first day of each month. But Ernie, I've also read the late fee provision that gives the tenant additional time. That's usually a misunderstanding that both landlords and tenants have about the lease. Generally speaking, the late fee provision doesn't extend time for the due date of the rent. Instead, what it does is it allows a landlord to charge some additional amount in the event that rent has not been paid on time. Generally speaking, in the state of Texas, if rent is late after the third day of the month, there is a 2-day safe harbor after the rent due date when late fees simply cannot be assessed. So rent's due on the first. On the second and the third, rent can still be paid without a late fee if it's paid before the end of the third day. But once the fourth day hits, Texas law allows a landlord to assess a late fee, and a landlord is likely on day 4 to begin assessing that fee. However, this doesn't change the fact that rent, if it's stated this way in your lease, was due on the first or before, which means on the second, technically there is a default. How you treat that default is going to affect how your tenant makes subsequent payments and whether or not they're going to feel any impetus to do things differently. One really great response would be anytime rent is paid after the first to issue a notice of default. It's probably not time for you to issue a notice to vacate telling your tenant to scram. But if a tenant is paying late, you should put them on notice that this behavior is not acceptable. By delivering a written notice of default to your tenant, you're putting them on notice that multiple violations of the lease could result in eviction, but that when it comes to payment of rent, the tenant should pay in accordance with the lease, probably on or before the first day of each month, if that's the language that's in your lease. Don't hesitate to cite the language of your lease in your notice provision. It's always best to point directly and refer directly to the lease itself for the basis of the notice. Landlords, as always, we welcome you to follow us on our Instagram page. If you're not a member yet, join us on Facebook. And if you enjoy what you see here, give us a thumbs up. Click that like button. We enjoy that very much. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Now, some landlords don't like to take it this far. They'll send a text or a gentle reminder. But the reason that it's best to always send a formal written notice is because you have to assume that eventually you're going to be presenting these notices in a court proceeding in an eviction process. It's more difficult for you to say, well, I told him 100 times before, or I sent him all these texts, and maybe that's correct. However, you're better off using a more formal strategy if it turns out that ultimately you'll have to present these formal notices to the court as a justification for removal. So hopefully you never have to employ an actual policy when it comes to late payment, but you should have a policy in place. One very helpful thing is to have a stated policy that's in your house rules, which should be an addendum to your lease that is handed over to and acknowledged in writing by your tenant before you've ever handed the keys over to the rental unit. This policy should state pretty clearly the steps you take in the event of late payment. It should, as with the notice itself, point to and remind the tenant of what the lease says about the due date for rent. If it's due on or before the first of the month, you should emphasize that and mention that any violation of that policy is met with the following steps on your part. For example, you might say on day 2 you're going to receive an email or a text or a phone call. You may receive all of them. You might have a tenant who says, don't harass me with calls for the rent if it's not that late. I want to mention something. It is not harassment to ask for your rent payment, especially if that payment is in fact late. You are allowed to give notices to your tenant. That's assumed in the terms of your lease, and a notice of non-payment or a notice of late payment is a perfectly valid notice. It does not constitute harassment, and you're allowed to give it, particularly if the tenant has already agreed to this procedure because you have informed them of it before they ever signed the lease. But come up with a strategy. On what day will you send a text, an email, or give a call? On what day will you issue written notice? My hope is that even if they're a single day late, you are issuing written notice, but you may have a procedural day when you know that notice must be delivered. And finally, make sure that your late payment policy includes your determination to collect late fees whenever they are due. Remember to follow the laws in your jurisdiction and to make sure that late fees can even be assessed. But if it turns out that your tenant is paying late, make sure that a demand for the late fees is also made in conjunction with that late payment. Your late fee should be a deterrent to your tenant and hopefully serves in that capacity and prevents any future late payments. Now, sometimes your tenants are going to come to you with a sad story. But if your tenants come to you with a sad story every month, this is an indication that they're just not a good fit for this rental. I always encourage landlords to listen to their tenants, but don't let a tenant's sad story derail you from your stated policy. Follow the policy all the way to the end, even if that includes an eviction filing, because you're going to want to be able to say at a later time, if it turns out that your tenant was in fact sincere about what was going on, that you're able to, at any point in the process, simply withdraw your eviction. But if it turns out your tenant wasn't exactly sincere, well, then you've already taken steps to have them removed in a process that takes a considerable amount of time. The sooner you begin that process, the better for you. So make sure if you have a policy stated that deals directly with late payment or non-payment, that you adhere to that policy until you know that the matter is fully resolved. So let's say that you've had the occasion where you've issued a notice of default for a late payment and another, and finally you're in a month where instead of a notice of default, you simply tender a notice to vacate. If late payment or non-payment is happening on a regular basis, again, you need to move on from this tenant. This is not a good fit. Now, you may, in the middle of the eviction proceeding, get word from your tenant, no, I've got all the late fees, I've got court costs, I've even got attorney fees along with the full amount of the rent, but I really need for you to withdraw this eviction. A couple things to consider. First, is this a tenant who you want to keep on as a tenant? Do you trust them to be able to continue to make future months of rent? If the answer is no, then don't stop anything. Proceed with your eviction, even if they can pay you everything that's owed after you have filed your eviction. Now, the court may not like the sound of it, but if you've got a laundry list of prior defaults that you can take with you to the court, it might serve as an adequate demonstration of the reason that you're seeking possession. Even if the tenant can otherwise make things better, you can let the judge know that your intention is to recover property and to lease it out to someone else or to occupy it yourself, because this particular tenant unfortunately has a history of defaults and will likely default again. Now, there are some of you out there who are saying, well, if those were the facts in my situation, I would take the unpaid rent, the late fees, and any court costs and attorney fees that would be reimbursed to me, and I would simply live out the rest of the lease. That's an important consideration for you, depending on how many months are left on the lease. If, for example, it's just 2 or 3 months and you have every confidence that those 2 or 3 months will be paid, by all means, you can finish out the lease and hopefully this tenant will in fact vacate at the end of the term. However, if there's still multiple months left, you really have to consider whether or not you're simply going to be back here at a later date. Generally speaking, a bad tenant is a bad tenant, and while they might fix up their act for a short term, it may turn out that later you're going to find yourself in exactly the same spot, possibly a worse spot. If you are going to accept a tenant back and you are going to accept all of the fees that are owed to you at the time, and the tenant is willing to pay them, you'll have to make a decision. And you'll have to decide whether or not it makes business sense for you to keep this tenant than to lose this tenant and go out and search for a new one. However, unless you are being fully compensated for all of the losses that you have incurred, I would probably turn them away. If they're looking to pay the base rent without any fees, court costs, or attorney's fees, they probably still just can't afford to live on your property. Probably not a very good deal for you. Particularly as you approach the end of a month. Remember, the fact that they're paying you such a large sum of money probably means that they're not paying some other bill. And if you're at the end of the month and you know there's no way they're going to be able to pay the next month, again, this may not be as good a deal as it looks, perhaps at first glance. Make sure if you are at the end of the month that any agreement for the tenant to stay includes payment of the subsequent month at or around the same time, certainly before you ever decide to dismiss your eviction. Make sure that you've recovered all of your past losses and that you're still good for the next 30 days, in that the rent for the subsequent month is either in hand or is being paid early, or that you won't dismiss until that subsequent month is in fact paid. You're always going to want to position yourself in a way that makes the most business sense. You don't want to leave money on the table, and you certainly don't want to set a pile of money on fire. Make sure that when you're making a deal with your tenant regarding unpaid rent, that you consider all of these factors. The fact that rent is probably laid after the first day of the month and written notice should be given. The issuance of those notices and the timetable in which they will be delivered in every case. That stated policy is an important one that probably should be featured in your lease and should be shared with your tenants upon move-in. Finally, consider the costs. Even if your tenant is willing and able to pay everything that's owed, consider what's right around the bend. Consider just how much longer you and that tenant are sticking together by virtue of this contract. And consider what is at risk if you accept some amount of money but don't accept the full amount, or if you accept some amount of money but anticipate you'll be unable to recover next month's rent on time. These are all signs that it's time for you to move on from this tenant. For more information on how to respond to tenant defaults, there is a video right here that I know you will enjoy. And until next time, landlords, happy leasing.